always works so much better when you unmute yourself. But I'm delighted to be here, and I'm even more delighted that Betty's here. Betty is dedicated to the importance of conversation for the purpose of understanding issues and solving problems. Many of you probably recall the What's Next West Virginia project of a few years ago. Libraries were really involved in that one. Others of you may have attended one of the Civic Life Institutes. It's presented by the West Virginia Library Center for Civic Life. I've served on the Civic Life Board for several years. Betty was there before me, and even though she's retired as executive director of the center, she's still there, and that's a good thing. One of the things that Betty asked me to do as a board member at one of my first Civic Life Institutes was to speak to the attendees about the role of libraries. And on that occasion, I referred to the role of libraries as the front porch of democracy. Everybody is welcome, all opinions are respected, and conversation, whether that conversation be in print, in person, online, that conversation opens and informs minds. And I didn't coin the term front porch of democracy in reference to libraries. Sort of wish I did, but I have certainly used it. So let's get comfortable on our real or virtual front porches here and learn about the With the People initiative. I just forwarded a message for the American Library Association to all public library directors this morning that invites you to, well, invites libraries in small and rural communities, and that's pretty much all of us, to apply for a grant to develop a community engagement program. And to provide, the grant will also provide flexible funding to support community engagement and that program. And I think Betty was involved in the creation of this grant opportunity, or at least conversations about the creation of this grant opportunity. And another phrase or concept from that announcement is going to become a standard part of my conversations about the importance of libraries. And it is, libraries are places to quench curiosity, access technology, and explore new ideas, hobbies, and careers. Increasingly, libraries also offer patrons welcoming and virtual and physical spaces to meet their neighbors, to discuss and resolve important issues. That is a role of the library and a role we're going to talk about today. Thank you all for attending.
Thank you so much, Karen. As a matter of fact, I love it when we think alike, because the last slide that people will see today is how to apply for that grant you just mentioned. It's called, the program is called Libraries Transforming Communities, which I have seen happen many times myself. It's a grant program of the American Library Association. And at the end of, in case that's interesting to you after you see what we're talking about today, if you want to see a way that you can use that grant funding, it's up to $3,000 per library to help your community work together on an issue, then there'll be a slide, plus Karen, it's probably in your inbox from Karen as well. Let me just start off. Karen's
already sort of scary, Betty, that we
I know.
are so often on the same page with it.
Well,
We did not discuss this.
Okay, so so basically here's what we're gonna do today. Although we want to make time to talk, look for questions in the chat and be as responsive as we can, and follow up later if we need to too. Considering the role of libraries in community discussions that let people talk together about issues that they care about that impact their lives, we're going to explore some of the concepts and practices about doing that in a productive way. I want to share with you some information about resources. Although I'm joining you from my home here in Charleston, where I do all of my work these days, pretty much, since most of us are staying put. I work with a national organization called the National Issues Forums Institute. And through the National Issues Forums Institute, there are so many free resources that I want to make sure you know about that can assist you in any work that you might want to do on a whole range of issues, including how to do that online, because that's where a lot of us are doing our work and connecting with our communities these days. And then take questions about any possibilities for moving forward with this. So that's the general outline of how we'll spend our time. We'll talk about some questions. Every now and then you'll hear us say the word deliberation, which is a common word when you think about what juries do, but it's not usually that common in terms of the way we think about getting conversations going in our own communities, why it matters, what the impact is on the civic life of our places, and then ways in which the libraries can take the lead and have taken the lead in the past. So I'm just going to start off with a really basic question. And that is, why is it important for people to talk about issues? And obviously, I'm putting it in the connection of why public libraries and academic libraries might want to be involved in this work. So why do it when there are so many reasons why people think we can't do it? I mean, we're living in a pretty divisive era right now in terms of talking about public issues together. And we're facing huge public issues that are extremely challenging under any circumstances to be able to talk about. And so one of the reasons that, as I've talked to people in West Virginia and other places about the importance of having kind of productive conversations together, sometimes people are really leery of going there. And here's why. They think it's going to be like that. They think they're going to sponsor something at the library or in a church basement or at some organization, and angry people that are extremely opinionated and divided are going to show up, and it's going to be a hard to handle kind of conversation. So if they're thinking that they're going to get this or that, you can imagine why people might not want to dip their toe into these waters. But I can tell you, over many, many years, much, much, much more frequently, what I've seen when conversations are structured in a productive way that allow different points of view, not just to be tolerated, but actually welcomed and needed, then I've rarely seen a conversation go like that. I've seen other kinds of conversations, though. So I'll show you a few of those based on why you might want to talk in your own community. And I'm using the word community pretty generally here, because you may be talking about the area in which your library is located. You could be talking about the entire county. But given that we have so much access now to online platforms like what we're using today, Zoom, the community could be throughout the state of West Virginia. So we're not necessarily talking just about a geographical community. Most people want to learn more about an issue. They're often trying to build some kind of connections. Some people are really eager and know that it's necessary to understand different points of view, and they want to set directions for taking some action together. So different discussions have different purposes from the outset, but for many people, it's all of the above. So keep that in mind as you think about what role your library might want to play in helping people find ways to talk to each other. So I thought, just to show you how possible this has been, in part because of the work of libraries, but lots of other organizations as well in the state, let me just show you some West Virginians at work who have been doing this kind of work in the past. Okay, these folks came together. This is in Martinsburg, West Virginia, and they're talking about how to have safe, healthy environments for kids after school. They knew that there were a lot of children in school that were coming home and didn't necessarily have after-school care available to them. And so they were trying to figure out what was the role of the community, what might be useful in terms of helping those children and families who needed to be at work. This was a discussion that happened, I think you were in this one, Karen. This happened in Charleston not too long ago. And they were trying to think about, they were talking about St. Albans and how can St. Albans have a thriving economy, especially since young people were leaving. So they were talking about ways in which that community might help younger people, and these happen to be people talking about younger artists, stay and thrive in St. Albans and help contribute to the economy. This was in Buchanan. I happen to remember this one. They were talking about fracking and natural gas extraction and the pros and cons of what that was contributing to in the area. You can see this one was in southern West Virginia. They were talking about the layoffs of coal miners, and how to kind of build an economy that would fill up some of the gaps. So you can see there's a whole range of issues that people in West Virginia have been talking about. This one was in Beckley, and so was this. And they were talking about what the public schools might be able to do in order to prevent students from dropping out of school before they were able to graduate. And this one was in Huntington. And in Huntington, they were talking about a whole range of issues, but I think I wasn't there, but I believe this one in particular had to do with the opiate crisis that they were facing and how that was impacting the quality of life, the economy, and everything else. So these were all very civil, very productive, deliberative conversations where people listened to different points of view, where they considered the trade-offs they might have to make in order to move forward, and they were able to set some directions for acting together in a variety of ways, or at least they just became very well informed about what was happening. So I'm going to come back just to that word deliberation for a moment, and that is expand beyond what you think juries do, because juries, they listen to evidence, they weigh the evidence, they make a decision. That's the role of a jury. But in these situations, these people weren't juries. They were residents of West Virginia talking together about different ways they might move forward on issues. And they were, in some cases, disagreeing with different points of view, agreeing with others, but they were being deliberative in the way that we think of the word. Whenever I ask people to think about it in your own life, just think of a time in your own life where you've had to make a tough decision that involved more people than just you, and that it would impact more people than just you. You were being deliberative, even in your family or in your group of friends, when you were able to do that. So this brings me to the topic of today, which is this initiative, which we're calling With the People. Now, I'm sure you've heard of the people, by the people, for the people. Those are all great prepositional phrases. But with the people is one I think we don't think about that much or as much. And the idea is based on the thought that whenever we find ways for people and their institutions, such as libraries, and their governments work with each other and talk with each other, then we've strengthened democracy and we've made progress on issues that are impacting our lives. So this is about that part of the work. It is about helping people find ways to talk together. Now, people could just meet up on a street corner or over the backyard fence. I mean, there's all kinds of casual ways that people interact with each other. But what I've seen libraries and other organizations do is intentionally provide space and opportunity for people to have those kinds of discussions. So that's what we're talking about, kind of intentional and kind of strategic thinking that allows people to come together as part of the community life and what role libraries might play in that. Now, some of these organizations you might be familiar with. These are all partners at the national level. That some of them are higher ed, some of them are civic organizations, some of them are research foundations. There's all kinds of different organizations. This is a growing list of partners. And I'm hoping that there's a unit at the American Library Association that I've been working with. I hope they'll become a partner in the future as well. But here in West Virginia, there's already activity or interest by a whole range of organizations, obviously libraries. In November, the community colleges in the state are all going to have deliberative discussions on their campuses, and then they're going to come together over Zoom with students from the various community colleges talking about how West Virginia can have a strong economic recovery. After what we've been going through recently. And so there's community colleges, faith groups, nonprofits, all these groups are part of building the kind of infrastructure that Karen referred to over the years of work that we've been doing in West Virginia. So we're going to think about the important public issues here in West Virginia and beyond. These conversations can take place in person at your library if your library is having in-person meetings. But I know we're in various stages of reopening and working remotely. And so everything that I'm describing today can also happen over Zoom or other platforms that I'll tell you about if you're interested in doing that. Some of these conversations are happening in classrooms and on campuses, which means libraries might want to have an opportunity to connect with local schools or colleges in these kinds of conversations as well. As I'm talking, if there's anything that I'm saying that you'd like to ask a question about, just stick it in the chat, and I'll keep my eye on the chat and respond in real time. We'll also have some time at the end, but it'd be nice to be able to respond to your questions in the moment too. So please just do that as we go through. I mentioned having discussions on Zoom. Back in March, I'd never had a deliberative discussion over Zoom. Now, I'd had meetings on Zoom. I did planning discussions. Um, but in March, when I was working with a lot of people that had all these in-person discussions planned at their libraries, in their communities, and it all got canceled. Everything got canceled. And they didn't know how to necessarily move forward until we started experimenting with using a platform like Zoom. I'm not trying to advertise Zoom. I'm just saying this is the one we've used, a platform like Zoom, in order to allow people to continue to have the discussions they wanted to have. And it's been amazingly helpful. So one of the things that we've been doing at National Issues Forum Institute is collecting examples of how people are using online platforms to continue to have community discussions. And to put together tips and strategies for how people can do that. When you go to the website that I'm going to show you later, you'll find a video from someone showing you what they learned about doing Zoom forums. We have handouts on how to do Zoom forums. There's a lot of information. Of course, the Zoom platform itself tells you a lot about how to use Zoom, but I'm talking about how to use it in order to have a productive, deliberative conversation. So that's what we've been trying to connect and provide information about. Now, I don't know most of these schools. You probably don't know most of these schools, but I put this up here because I wanted you to see what was possible. And I was invited to just sit in on this. This was a discussion in the state of New York. If you count, there are 36 logos of 36 different community colleges and universities, but I'm thinking libraries when I'm saying it to you. And together they used the Zoom platform, and they said any students from any of those schools could participate. When I signed in, there were 187 students from across the state of New York, from these 36 different schools, and they were talking about how to keep voting safe and secure and accessible. So that was the issue they were concerned about. They were having a deliberative forum about improving our elections process and making sure that it was accessible to all who were eligible to vote. So I just wanted to show that to you because it was very inspiring to me to see that many students talking. Now, obviously, 187 students didn't talk to each other all at one time. So this is a great feature in Zoom. If you've been using it much, you know Breakout Rooms. And it's very simple to use. And so if you had 187 people show up, you could click a button and you could put them into groups of 8 or 10 or whatever you decided. So that's what they did. They started together, they broke them into smaller groups, and then they came back together to reflect. At the end, I remember one of them said, it was really great to have this kind of conversation and to be with people we normally couldn't be with, because they made sure that students from Manhattan were in groups with people from, let's say, rural upstate New York, people that didn't normally get a chance to talk together. One of them said, I've never really talked about a public issue this way. I wonder if we could get our policymakers to do that. So that would be nice. But that was that they were seeing some value in it in that way too. There's another platform I want to tell you about, and I can follow up with you more later if you're interested in this. There's a chat-based online platform that we can give you access to, which means that instead of seeing faces and voices, people would be chatting. Now, you may think, well, I'd rather see your face and your voice, and I'm probably in that camp myself. But a lot of people like the chat feature because they're able to, people like to kind of think what they're going to say and then write it down. I don't mean to make it generational, but if you're really used to being in a lot of chat platforms, then you probably like that a lot. So there's one where people can have a deliberative discussion through chat. It's got a lot of really interesting graphics and elements that are part of that as well. So here are some of the issues, and it's not limited to these issues, but these are some of the issues that are a part of this With the People initiative. Voting, I mentioned, that's the one that the students in New York were talking about. There's also discussion materials, and I'll show you some of these materials in just a minute. There are discussion materials about policing. What should be done to ensure equal justice and fair treatment in our communities. Obviously, that is of major concern throughout the country. And so there have been some really important and interesting discussions that people are having about this, where they really try to get different points of view together and figure out which way their community should move forward in terms of having fair and just treatment in their communities. Immigration is an issue that is always important around the country. Various states have different levels of immigrants in their own states, but everybody has connections to immigration. Back to work. That has to do with rebuilding our economy after the various shutdowns and changes we've had in our employment around the country. A new land has to do with what kind of government we want and what we should have. Free speech is mainly geared toward campuses. So if a library wanted to partner with a local college or university, this might be one that you might want to look at. So now there are lots of other issues that are relevant across the country, and other materials have been developed. These are just the newest ones. And so I wanted you to see the most current and newest issues that have been developed. Now, when I say developed, what that means is a lot of research is done by the Kettering Foundation. That's a private non-profit research foundation, private operating foundation, that looks at what people's concerns are around the country. They look at a lot of research. It's a very nonpartisan approach to looking at public issues, and they develop discussion materials. And so that we use those materials. They're widely tested to make sure that people find them to be accurate and fair, and that different points of view are described. So there are these discussion materials. There are guides for people who are moderators, people who are the discussion leaders and are trying to come up with good questions to promote deliberative discussion. Questionnaires for you to collect information after a discussion. If you want to study any of these issues or look at them in connection to the Constitution, we've developed these connector pieces that connect the issue itself to the public policy. Slides, all kinds of issue-based slides. If you're going to do this on Zoom, rather than you having to do all that work yourself for each one of you that wants to do this, we've just done them, and you can put them up on your screen in the same way that I'm doing this now. There are discussion starter videos that if you come into a discussion and you haven't looked at any background on it, but you want to kind of start on the same footing, there are brief videos that kind of overview the issues in 4 or 5 minutes and allow people to kind of get their head into the issue itself and what they might want to say about it. And then all kinds of tips for online discussions. So not only are all of these issues and more that I don't even have here available to libraries for discussions, all these support materials are available as well. And these are, as I said, they're all complimentary. They're all free downloads. If you want to have in-person conversations, we can mail you some print copies. So those are the kinds of things that would be available to you as well. I'm just going to stop for a second to check and see if anybody has a question, or I'm assuming, Heather, is it also okay if they unmute themselves and just ask a question if they'd like to do that? Well, I think everybody has the capacity to do that. But if you try to unmute yourself and you can't, then put the question in there. Maybe
fine, Betty. Anybody that wants to unmute themselves and doing it,
they have
an invitation to them to do that or use the chat. I know some of them, if you're on your phone or something, it's sort of difficult to switch back and forth.
Yes, yeah. So are there any questions so far about what we're talking about in terms of deliberation? What kind of issues are available? What kind of materials? Anything about the role of libraries? Anything that anybody would like to ask at this time? Okay, well, I'll move on, and I'll stop a few more times too. So if there's something else that you want to ask about, make sure you do that. So I don't, if there's actually a polling feature in Zoom. If I'd thought ahead, I could have used it. The question I would have put up there is, how many of you have ever been in a deliberative discussion, a really deliberative discussion about a public issue? And if I would have had that up there, you would have clicked a button on your computer, and in 1 minute, we would know what percentage of people in this discussion had ever been in a deliberative discussion before. I have a feeling that some of you have, and probably many of you haven't been. Once, when I first started this work many years ago, I was in a discussion or a forum that was actually on the University of Charleston campus, but it was for the city of Charleston. It wasn't just for the campus. And it was a really good discussion. Over 80 people showed up. Now, that's not typical, but over 80 people showed up for that discussion. The students had done a wonderful job of outreach, and we had a great discussion. And at the end, one of the students said, I can't believe that I'm 19 years old and I'm a political science major, and I've never had an opportunity to talk about an issue this way before. I've only debated issues, but I've never had an opportunity to talk about issues like this before. And right away from across the room, a woman said, "Don't feel bad, honey. I'm 80 and it's my first time too." So I think that just shows you that there's probably a shortage of opportunities for people to talk about issues anywhere in the country. I know for many years, Karen and I have worked with the West Virginia Center Pacific Life to help in their effort in efforts in order to provide more opportunities for people. A few years ago, there were 132 forums around the state on prescription drug abuse. So there are opportunities to talk, but not as much, and that's why we're hoping that some libraries will be interested in taking the work forward. So just to give you a sense of what would happen in a deliberative forum, there's not one way that it always works, and it can happen over time. It can happen one time. But in general, people start off with some kind of an introduction and go over some guidelines. Some people call them ground rules. Basically, just some opportunities for people to agree on the various guidelines that will lead their discussion. Not at all about what they'll say, but just the parameters for the discussion. People usually make some connection to the issue about why it's important to them. Most of these issues are very important to all of us. That's why they rise to the level of being national issues. But they are different. They are relevant to us in different ways. Some of us have personal experience with some of the issues. Some of us have concerns about other people that we know, or we're just interested in general in the welfare of our communities. People will consider various options. So if there is an issue related to any of the ones I described, you can imagine that there'll be different approaches to how to address that issue. And each approach would be based on different principles, different ideas. People would connect with it differently. Some might want to say, part of this works, part of it doesn't. There's weighing that goes on. That's the deliberation part. So they'll be considering options. And then they kind of reflect on where they've been. If there were any areas of common ground on which they want to build, do they want to continue talking about the issue and what else might be done? So it's a basic structure that we've seen happen again and again and again. At this point, it would be beyond hundreds, to say thousands of times in West Virginia over almost 30 years. So these are some of the guidelines or ground rules that I mentioned. And I think you'll see they're pretty reasonable. They're pretty fair. They're just ones that people have come up with over the years. There's nothing that is sacrosanct about these. You can make up others that you think work with your group along these lines. So you want to ask people to really focus on the options and actions so that you don't get too sidetracked. You're really kind of using a common framework. You want to be fair about considering all the options, not just the ones the group that you're with happens to like the best. You want to listen as well as speak. And a lot of times, even when we're not speaking, we're thinking about the next thing we're going to say, which isn't really active listening. So you're really trying to encourage people to really listen closely to other people. You want to make sure that not one or two people would dominate a conversation. A lot of times people don't do that because they're domineering people. They just have a lot to say and they're enthusiastic and they don't realize they're taking so much time. And so it's important to say at the beginning that we're going to allow time for many people to speak, that it'll be an open and respectful atmosphere and that everyone is encouraged to participate. Now, I've used guidelines like these in a lot of deliberative forums, but these are guidelines that you might want to use in all kinds of discussions that you might host. There are discussions that libraries host on with other practices, and so these might be useful to you for those as well. So here's just an example so you can get your head around what I mean by the materials that are available to you. This is the discussion guide on the right, Back to Work, How Should We Rebuild Our Economy? Now, since it was done nationally, it's looking at possibilities throughout the country. But we know that different parts of our economy, different parts of our country have been impacted very differently. So West Virginia might not be struggling in the same ways as another part of the country that had different economic pressures. We know pretty much across the country, restaurants, for example, and the travel industry are really hurting. But there are other elements of our economy that are doing differently in different places. So you could personalize this conversation to West Virginia and talk about how should we rebuild West Virginia's economy. It doesn't have to be the nation as a whole. Or I just use this because that's where I know there's a really cool library. How should we rebuild Putnam County's economy? So you could just locate it in your county. Or how should we rebuild Winfield's economy? Or you could probably, narrow it down some more to a particular part of Winfield if that's what you wanted to do. So the idea is you start with something that is kind of nationally framed, but then you localize it to what you think residents of your community are concerned about and what the kind of information is on the ground that you'd be looking at. This is, I just put this there, I won't play it, but it's a 4-minute conversation starter. So it's a video that overviews the issue at hand, shows different points of view, different questions that you might want to consider together. It's really helpful because people can have a common place to start if they've seen this video together. You could use it in a community setting, but you can also, if you're on Zoom, you can just play this while you're in your a Zoom setting as well. There's some strategic information. You probably won't be at all surprised to see this graph. That's how the unemployment rose in the 3 months of the COVID-19 compared to 2 years of the Great Recession. So you could just see what happened to us collectively in April and May of 2020 and our economic challenges. I thought this one might be particularly interesting to libraries. It's certainly very interesting to people who are in public education right now, or any kind of education. Look at the differences between urban populations in this country and their access to broadband. This is in 2018, and rural populations and access to broadband in rural parts of the country. It's a dramatic difference, and it's a challenge that's facing libraries right now. Some of the work I'm doing with the group Karen mentioned, the Libraries Transforming Communities program of the American Library Association. They want to do community discussions, but they're having problems because a lot of the community residents don't have access to the internet. Or even the library doesn't have a really strong internet connection. And they're trying to find different ways to work around that, developing hotspots that people can connect to. One of the real tragic things that I've been hearing librarians say, and they're very distressed about this because they love the idea of a library being that place in a community where people who don't have internet can come to get online. But when libraries have had to shut down, then, or they have different protocols for who can come in and how many at one time, then people don't have that source of connection anymore either. And in parts of West Virginia, as you know, it's not just a matter of whether or not people can afford it, although that's important. But even if you can afford it, there are places in the state that you aren't going to have a strong enough internet connection to really work from home or do the kind of remote learning that you need as a library or educator. So these are some of the pieces of information that we can provide to you to kind of give some grounding for the discussion. There's a part in the discussion guide that's an approach. What would it take to jumpstart the economy? And people would talk about that. They would talk about the actions that might be possible, the drawbacks that might be possible. This would be the case for any of the discussion guides that I'm mentioning. I'm just showing you this one as an example. And I'm also showing you the kind of slides that we can give you if you want to do this yourself, because you wouldn't have to make these. They would already be available for you. One other feature of this discussion guide is it's called an interactive PDF. So if you want to do this discussion in West Virginia, there are places in the PDF that you would download where you can put in information about Rupert or Roncevert or Raynell or any of the other art communities. Those are 3 of my favorite named communities in West Virginia, that you can put in information about the place where you are to make it even more relevant. So what you would do is you just delete some of this text, you'd put in the text that you'd want, and then you'd provide that to your participants. So let's see at this point, I'm going to check the chat again. If the discussion gets heated, is there any way on Zoom to get control? Muting can only do so much. That's a very good question from Leslie. Thank you, Leslie. As I said, I really have not seen that many heated discussions using this process, because what you say at the very beginning is, we not only will tolerate different points of view, we need different points of view. So you're contributing to the welfare of the group if you share that point of view. Now, having said that, that doesn't mean that that can't happen. So that's the reason why saying the guidelines at the beginning is really important. Because if somebody starts to get, certainly if they would get personal, a personal attack on someone, you can go back to the guidelines and try to actually recenter it in that way. You can encourage people. One of the questions I usually ask in a case like that, if somebody's being very adamant about their point of view and is, especially if they're doing it in a way that's being insulting to other people, not that they're just disagreeing is fine, but if they're doing it in the way that I think Leslie's referring to ask that person, I bet you've heard people disagree with you before. What's the best case anybody's ever made against this position that you're stating? Because what that does, that gets them out of the, I'm going to tell you what I think right now about this and make you believe in me, and if you don't, then you're there's something wrong with you. It makes them internalize, well, other people might think about this differently. So there are a lot of questions that moderators of these discussions can ask to try to get somebody to think, you're not trying to change their mind, you're just trying to get them to think about what somebody with a different point of view might see there. And if you're interested, Leslie, I have got reams of those kinds of questions that we can share with you about just those basic questions that moderators can ask in situations like that. I will say, if you really, really got to a point where somebody was being very, very overbearing and ruining the discussion and not allowing people to get in, that kind of thing, you'd have to use your controls. You have a control, you can mute people. We've probably all heard of people being even Zoom bombed, where you get unwelcome and uninvited participants coming in with this purpose of disrupting. And so there are controls in Zoom that you can take care of that. But in general, I've really never seen a conversation get to that point. Let's see here. Do you think a time limit guideline works too? That's a really good question, Sherry. I usually start off with a kind of a soft touch, and then I might have to get a little bit more structured if people are taking too much time. And so at the beginning, I just say things like, it's really important to mention share your comments fairly briefly so that many other people have an opportunity to talk. If somebody does tend to go on for too long, I tend to use body language. Now, I don't know, Zoom is not as good on body language because here we are, we're just all looking right in each other's faces. But if I were sitting in a circle, I'd probably kind of turn my seat and start looking at this person in order to let it be known that I'm bringing something, trying to bring somebody else into the conversation. And there's also other kind of questions you can ask. I'll tell you one of my, I'll never forget this experience. I was in a really wonderful discussion, and it was about drug abuse. And this was with a national group. And one of the young men in the discussion was a drug abuse counselor. And he knew so much about the issue, and he had really had a lot of, just personal stories to tell us about what he had dealt with. The problem was, every time he spoke, he took such a long time to say what he wanted to say. And his comments were valuable, but it just meant that hardly anybody else was getting a chance to speak. And so rather than just put him on the spot and say, you've talked too long, other people are trying to get in the conversation, I thought I'd be clever. And so I said, well, I didn't know much about him, but I knew he was not a mother. And so I said, what might a mother in this room have to say about the issue? And before anybody else could say a word, he said, well, if my mother were here, and then he went on to answer the question. So finally, I just had to be pointed with him, and I had to say, Peter, we really appreciate your comments, but it's important that other people get a chance to respond. And so, you try it different ways, but I think I would start off with a kind of a general admonition to everybody to be brief enough that other people can speak. But then if somebody is going overboard, you might want to intercede sooner than I did with Peter. I think I let Peter go on too long before I finally had to do something about it. Again, we have a ton of materials on tips and strategies for moderators in those situations that I can share beyond this time. Yeah. Any other questions? I really appreciate those. Are two really important questions. Can I ask if any of you have moderated a discussion about a public issue? What's the most challenging element of it to you? Or if you're imagining or thinking about having a discussion about a public issue, What might, give you pause? If you could just think about that a minute and just throw a few thoughts in the chat, it'd be really helpful to get a sense of where you might. I'm trying to. Transitions. Ah, transitions are hard, but I kind of love them because I'm always listening for that moment when you can move on to the next phase. What you saw in the structure that I provided is that there are usually 3 or more approaches. So you know from the beginning that you're not going to spend your whole time on just one approach. You're going to be looking at different ones. And so you can tell people up front, there'll be times when we have to move on before we've completely exhausted all there is to say about this issue. And so just bear with me because that's what we're going to have to do. And most people completely understand that. They know that you're not going to solve the healthcare crisis in a 90-minute discussion or even 20 90-minute discussions. And so they understand that you have to move on. But as a moderator, as you're kind of keeping an eye on the clock and knowing that it's time to move on, I always try to listen for a comment that's being made that also is a gateway into the next approach that we could look at. And surprisingly, it happens quite often if you're really listening for it. If it doesn't happen naturally, you can just you can just say, I know there's more to say about this, but we need to move on in the interest of time so that we have a fair hearing of all the approaches. So sometimes the transition isn't as smooth as you'd like it to be, but I think over time, you just kind of get used to listening for that next comment that's going to take you into the next approach. And since these approaches are not about 3 different things, they're all interconnected, it happens it happens quite often. Yeah. Any other challenges that you faced when you have facilitated a discussion, or anything that worries you about trying this in the future? Ah, thank you, Karen. I love that one. All right, remaining neutral. Honestly, you all are coming up with the greatest hits of questions because these are the very things that worry people the most. None of us are neutral people. I've never met a neutral person. We all have points of view. We have life experiences. We have things that have affected our thinking professionally. There's all kinds of things that are in our heads. So you don't just wipe that slate clean and say, I'm going to walk into this discussion as a completely blank slate. So there's a difference between, and it sounds like this is similar, but it's different. There's a difference between being neutral and behaving neutrally. Being neutral is something I don't think we can really be. Unless there's an issue you know nothing about or care nothing about, I guess on a particular issue you could be. But in general, we are not neutral. But behaving neutrally means that for the good of this group or for the good of my community at this moment in time, I'm going to behave neutrally. So that means not expressing my own opinion. Now, for some people, that's hard. If you're going to have a discussion about improving education and you've been working your whole life to improve education and you have a lot of deep-seated beliefs about that, it might be difficult for you to put those aside. But for some people, it wouldn't be so difficult. So I would say you would go into that group and you would ask questions that were open-ended. You would ask questions that invited a range of different perspectives. You don't express your own opinion. You ask for different opinions from the group. And so it's I think it's like a civic gift that you give to your community, because it means that you won't be able to say your opinion, but you're facilitating the opportunity for other people to do that. And that's a very admirable thing for people to do. I personally think that librarians are very good at doing that. They're researchers. They're people that have worked with a wide range of issues over the years. They're really, really practiced at working with the public. And so I think that, and I just, in general, these are all very positive stereotypes. I hope you'll forgive the stereotypes, but they're very good ones. I think of librarians as being, kind of open-minded and curious and just wanting more knowledge. And so I think librarians are particularly well suited to behaving neutrally in the discussions. One other thing I'll mention about that behaving neutrally, though, if you are extremely well known in your community for a particular point of view that you have on a controversial issue, even if you could behave neutrally, you might want to think if you're the person that should lead that particular discussion. And the reason I say that is because the perception of whether or not you should be the discussion leader could possibly be a stumbling block. And so I have a very good friend who is honestly probably one of the best facilitators I've ever seen in my life. She's just amazing. But she was well known in her community for taking a stand on what they should do with a school consolidation issue. Very controversial issue. And even though I knew as well as I knew anything that she would do an excellent job moderating that discussion, she came to me and she said, I don't think I should be the one to do this. And actually, I had to agree with her, even though I knew she would do it beautifully, because everybody in the community knew where she stood and they would be listening for that the whole time. And so she didn't moderate that particular one. Okay. Um, oh, how to draw people in who are too shy without putting them on the spot. I'm very sensitive to this one because I've been in discussions where somebody would say, well, you've been awful quiet. What do you have to say? And I know when they say that, they're trying to be inclusive and they're trying to make sure that somebody has an opportunity to speak. But to the person that's being said to, they might think that they're being called out for being too quiet. And maybe they're reflecting and thinking. And so I, generally speaking, don't call on somebody in a discussion, but I just continually provide opportunities. So I might say something like, is there somebody that we haven't heard from yet who'd like to enter the discussion now? Or let's pause for a minute and see if there's somebody who's been thinking about this, who hasn't had a chance to speak yet, has something they want to say, without saying specifically to someone that they're calling on them. Now, occasionally you can read the body language and you can tell when somebody's trying to get into a conversation. So if that's the case, you can kind of look at somebody, make a little eye contact, and you can kind of almost confirm, mentally that this person's trying to get into the conversation. But in general, I think that there are people who process their thoughts through speaking. There's a famous quote by a writer who says, "How do I know what I think until I see what I say?" And so some people just, they open their mouth and they kind of process their thinking as they're talking. Other people like to sit and reflect and internalize it. And they might have something to say at the end of the discussion, but they weren't ready at that moment. So I just kind of try to respect that people have different learning styles. They have different comfort levels with speaking in a public group. I do think that going into breakout rooms and having smaller discussions within the larger discussion helps people that may not want to speak in a group of 50, but they would speak in a group of 10. So you can try all of those different things, but there's been research that says the sooner in a discussion somebody says at least something, the more comfortable they'll be saying something later. Okay, so if that's true, and I think it is true, just from what I've seen, at the beginning of the conversation, I would go around in the group. Just this, not putting anybody on pressure to say what they think about anything. Just, who are you and why'd you come tonight? Or who are you and where you're from? Just to give everybody a chance to enter into the conversation just a little. And then you've broken the ice, your voice has been heard, you've said something about yourself, and there's no pressure on you because everybody's kind of doing it in a circular fashion. And then, and when I've taken the time to do that, then it makes a difference later, because I think people feel that they've kind of already broken the ice and they're ready to say something in the conversation. Try thinking, if you travel to another community you had no experience with or about, this enables you to be that respected facilitator. That is a great point. Thank you for making that one. Actually, because we've worked in West Virginia across county lines forever, we're always trying to develop networks in West Virginia. I've seen this happen on a number of occasions where people in two different counties who felt like, well, in my own county, I'm kind of known, or people already have it would be better if we had a facilitator that wasn't as well known. They just swapped the jobs. And so the folks from, Marion County might have gone over to the folks from Harrison County, and they just did this for each other, which I thought was a great way. And sometimes we try to do a little matchmaking behind the scenes because people will say, yes, I'll facilitate a forum, but I don't want to facilitate it in my own community. I'll do one someplace else. And that's what happened with some of those 132 forums on prescription drug abuse, is that people sometimes wanted to get outside of their own community to be the facilitator, because then that meant they could share their own opinions in their own community. So that's a great discussion and a great strategy. Yeah. Anything else that comes to your mind about challenges that, well, let me ask you to think about this one for just a minute. What's the most effective thing you've ever seen done in a discussion? Maybe you've done it yourself. If you don't want to brag on yourself, you can just put it in general terms. Just wonder, what have you ever tried that really worked well? And I imagine it'll take you a minute to think about that, because people can usually think of the challenges more readily. But if you've ever tried something that that you thought really worked well in a discussion, stick that in here too. That would be really helpful to know about. Well, I wanted to show, we'll come back to questions in just a minute. I wanted to tell you just one more thing about that grant, and then we'll come back to some of the opportunities. Now, these are two separate things. The With the People initiative is this national initiative that we're embracing here in West Virginia through libraries, community colleges, any partners that want to work with us. This is something that, that Karen and I happen to know about, that is through the American Library Association. It's called Libraries Transforming Communities. It's a focus on small and rural libraries. Now, I know not all of our libraries are small, but a lot of our libraries in West Virginia are small compared to other parts of the country that have massive libraries. So I think most of the libraries in West Virginia would still qualify here. Sometime before December 2nd, you'd have to put in your application. It's a relatively straightforward application. It's a $3,000 per library, up to $3,000. You can use it on a variety of things. If you needed a Zoom account, you could use it for that. If you, I actually was on a discussion the other day where they said you could even have this. I'll show you this thing. You know what this is? That's called a ring light, which I never heard of until a few months ago. But for a lot of us who are on Zoom all the time, I always felt that I was looking in the shadows, like I wasn't showing up. I'm in kind of a darker room, and it was $20 on Amazon, and it kind of lights up the room a little bit better. I think I'm seeing a little bit better. But anyway, even little equipment like that, if you needed to get some kind of a hot spot, you could use it for technology. You could use it for outreach. You could use it for any expenses that go into convening or bringing people together. So if you're interested in that, I would say take a look, because the things that we're talking about today are all about helping people have ways to talk and work together in your community. And if you're interested in pursuing any of these things, this grant may give you a little funding to support some of that work. Everything that I'm describing to you is free. I mean, all the materials and everything are free. But if you had incurred any other expenses for anything else that you want to do around that, so take a look at that and see if you'd be interested. I've been working recently with the Libraries Transforming Communities project, and I'm so impressed by what they're doing. And so you can go on the ALA website, just Google Libraries Transforming Communities. You'll see discussion materials. You'll see online modules to learn about civic engagement. There are so many great resources at the ALA website. So take a look there and see if there's anything that's particularly useful to you. Okay. Now, did anybody think of anything they've done really well? Okay. But no, but ring lights are catching on. Also, by the way, as far as we're talking about ring lights, there's one that fastens right onto the back of your computer. If you, like, let's say your computer's up against the wall and you don't have room to put this behind you, it's supposed to be shining in your face. So I can't put the ring light over here or behind me. It needs to be in front of me. So there's little ones that fasten on your community, on your computer as well. Okay. Okay, so any other comments, any questions? I'd really be interested to see what issues of the ones I mentioned, or even other issues you think might be most relevant in your own community. If you could throw some of those in the chat, it'd be great. I'd sort of get a sense of what is happening in your community. What do you think people need to talk about, or what do you think people want to talk about? Could a few of you just throw some stuff there in the chat so we'll get a sense about that as well? And while you're doing that, I'll mention one other that's under development. I was just in a meeting about this on Tuesday. We had some calls with people all around the country asking them what issues are really concerning people in your community right now. And they said pretty much the things that I just mentioned. They talked about economic recovery. They talked about will people be able to vote and how will they be able to vote, and just concerns about voting procedures in general. They talked about the issues related to policing, but the number one issue they mentioned was how do we continue to educate our children and keep them safe at the same time. Now, whether you have children in your home or not, every day we're hearing about whether or not children, which counties are open. You can go to the West Virginia Department of Education's website, and right there on the front page, that map is uploaded every Saturday at 5 o'clock, I think it is. You find out which counties are red, which are orange, which are gold, which are green, and which are yellow. And depending on the color of your county, that has to do with the predominance of positive cases of COVID in your community, and that means whether or not your children will be able to go to school in person or whether they'll be learning remotely. So that I certainly believe that's an incredibly important consideration in West Virginia. So we just jumped right on it, and there's a wonderful team of researchers and writers that are working on creating discussion materials about how we can educate our children and keep them safe at the same time. And that we just got started on that. So, and it's a team of people really from the Kettering Foundation that are working on that. But we're going to be doing a lot of, when we have a draft, if any of you would like to take a look at it and give us some feedback of whether you think this represents your community, would this be useful in your community, please let me know. I'd love to get that out to some of you and get your input on whether you think it's workable. So it'll be a few weeks or so before that's available in terms of just like taking a look at it, and then it'll take a while longer to really get it tested and ready to use. But that's coming, and it looks like we're going to be dealing with this for quite a while in terms of. We don't really know what we're dealing with completely and what the timeline is going to be, but we want to get that out in the most timely way so that people can talk about those issues. I'm looking at some of the other issues. Businesses closing. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. That is something that the economic recovery discussion guide that I showed you tries to get at that. And of course, you could localize that to what businesses and what challenges in your own community, restaurants and others as well. The broadband issue is, we're just hearing it constantly. As Sherry mentions, families as well as businesses, certainly, absolutely schools, just the ability of people to be able to even work from home if they're in a field, and of course a lot of people are in fields where that's not possible. That's of concern as well. That broadband issue is part of the education framework that's under development, and it's part of the economic recovery framework that you already have there. The homeless population. Thank you, Laura. That's an issue that is actually in What's Next West Virginia that Karen mentioned. That was an initiative we started back in 2014, but it's still going on in certain parts of the state, asking people to identify the issue that is the most relevant in their community that they want to start with. We all have multiple issues. And the folks in Parkersburg said the issue that they really wanted to talk about first was homelessness. And so they went through a series of questions. It wasn't like a prescribed, wasn't a pre-done framework. They just had a series of questions that they asked people in the community to respond to in conversation that allowed them to really make progress on how they provided services and identified people who were in need in Wood County. And so I'd be glad, let's see, Laura asked me about that one. Laura, if you want to send me an email, my address will be up at the end, and I'll be glad to send you those questions, or I can send pretty much these things to any of you that want them. Because I've seen people in other parts of the country have also developed frameworks for talking about homelessness. That need is increasing now, obviously, with so much economic hardship that people are experiencing. And so we often share frameworks with each other. I had a colleague one time who gave me a call. We were working on a framework here in West Virginia called Making Ends Meet. And it was about working families that are struggling to make ends meet, even though they're working, and sometimes working 2 jobs. And she was doing some work in South Dakota on the Rosebud Reservation, which is predominantly what's a Native American reservation. And she called and she said, Betty, can we use that West Virginia framework in South Dakota? And I said, does it work? Does it resonate? Does it fit? And she said, yes. Some of the challenges that people are experiencing in South Dakota are very similar to some of the experiences that you're having in West Virginia. So there are other states that have been looking at homelessness and have some materials that they put together that I'd be glad to share, in as much as you think they would be useful here. Otherwise, then I can send you those questions, that set of questions that allowed people to make some progress on dealing with homeless services and homeless population. Is the ALA grant annual, or is it only available during the COVID epidemic? It's not specifically tied to the COVID epidemic, but it is tied to some funding that ALA has had for the last, I think probably about the last 18 months or so. So I'm not sure how much longer it will go on. I know that this round just got released, and you have until December to apply. So I'm not sure. I can try to find out, Amy, or you can maybe just look at the library's transforming communities part of that site. It might tell you, but I have a feeling it will depend on whether or not their funding is renewed. Yeah. Sherry talks about reaching children that are not in stable home situations, who are lacking safety at school. That's what we're hearing a lot from people who are so concerned about the safety of children if they go to school, and the safety of children if they don't go to school, knowing that for many children, the safer environment could be the school environment. And so that's what we're trying to get our hands around in terms of creating a framework that relates to educating children safely during COVID. But it also applies to educating our children in West Virginia at all times, because they're COVID or not, there are children who need more support in order to be in safe places. Yeah. Any other comments or thoughts or questions? Karen, what am I leaving out? These are great questions. I really appreciate them.
I can't think of a whole lot. I think we could go on for a long time about talking about things. I think what you have sort of unearthed here is what you and I have thought. There is an interest, and there is a definite role for libraries to play here, and finding that. And as a lot of libraries are struggling, what do we do if we can't have groups in for adult programming? And I think there are tie-ins, say if you're going to want to focus on homeless issues. Well, our keynote speaker for this conference talked about librarians and the homeless and the serving and things. So maybe it's a tying that all in together, maybe even working with staff or libraries in the area, or just doing it because Zoom is so non-locational, saying, hey, let's do a librarians discuss homelessness, conversation on that. Yep. And most of all, we know each other, and I think instituting something like that, we could all practice our skills, even from Zoom skills to moderating skills to like breakout room type discussions. Maybe you're not ready to moderate the big group, but boy, you'd be comfortable with a group of 6 or 7 folks to just, and one question: what do we want? What is important about this to us as librarians, or to our library, or something like that? I can see so many possibilities here. And then taking that into the community, and librarians know who the people are in their community, and partner with them. I mean, we preach partnerships all the time, and libraries being trusted institutions. There aren't a lot of those around. We should, take advantage of that perception and true perception of libraries.
Yes.
And build on it to deliver more to our communities, to say we are an active part of this community. And I think things that appeal to adults or would involve adults helps dispel that perception of libraries are just for little kids. They're a lot for little kids, and we do a lot for little kids, but our community is so much bigger than that.
Yeah. People talk about how so many Americans are losing faith in various institutions, or their trust is being shaken, or they're doubting, or they're trying to defend and uphold their institutions, but they're kind of on the in a position where some haven't been before. But libraries are the steady, stable. You hear such trust in what people have, and I hope value that people see in the work of librarians. Karen, I love the idea of starting with a group of librarians talking to each other. As a matter of fact, that's what we're going to do. I think next week, it's going to be faculty of community colleges, and we're going to work together first. And then those faculty are going to work with their students. And then hopefully maybe those students will be a part of community connections. But it's just starting with something internal, kind of getting the lay of the land, getting the feel for it, kind of building up a little bit of experience and practice. I say that knowing that I'm probably talking to some people who are very experienced and very practiced in this. But there's probably a range of different experience with leading conversations among those of you who are on this call. And so starting with something internal like that, it sounds like a great idea. I'd love to work with you on that if you think it would be useful. Some other things that I'll just mention a few things. If you wanted to do that, try offering from your library as a public programming option, because I know a lot of libraries just are still trying, even with the pandemic, they're still trying to do some public programming online. If you'd be interested in that chat-based platform, it's possible that we can just set up one of those for West Virginia. And the link would only go to people that you gave it to. So usually if you set one up across the country, people from anywhere, any place in the country can participate in that. But if we wanted to have one that was just something that West Virginia librarians were a part of, or that just the people that you wanted to give it to through your library were a part of, we can set that up. And it's, as I said, it's a chat base. So the platform's already there. We would just upload one of these discussion guides, and that could be an interesting practice as well.
So it would be easier on. We have seen some comments about data issues. Libraries attending lots and lots of Zoom meetings, perhaps from home, and getting that little notice from AT&T. I get it about every month. You have overrun your, shall we add, 50 more, gigabytes or whatever of data to your thing for a small charge. That small charge has become, just permanent on my bill now. I don't know how I'll ever make it go off. I guess maybe when I stop using it so much I can help. But that is an issue, and it's a work from home issue too. Mm-hmm. For people. We say people can work from home, but some of them don't have the home internet capacity.
Yes.
To support it.
That's right. And what if you have two people in your family trying to work from home at the same time?
Exactly.
All kinds of issues like that. We keep getting notices from our cable provider. We're going over our monthly allotment. And then, of course, it's another surcharge there, another surcharge there. So anyway, those are some of the challenges that we have to layer in on top of all these other challenges that we're dealing with. Becky asked, are there any specific changes you've seen in communities after they've had these discussions? And the answer is yes. Now, it doesn't always happen in a lockstep fashion, like we had this discussion and then we did these things. So a lot of times people leave a discussion or a series of discussions. I really want to emphasize that a lot of these issues require more than one conversation. They leave the discussions kind of thinking, maybe not changing their mind necessarily, although some do. They might leave thinking about possibilities in a different way. And so those people may just go out and impact their own families or impact their own workplaces or their own communities. And so it's harder to kind of trace what happens when individuals have kind of been transformed in some way by a conversation and behave differently or decide to do different things. But in some communities, and I'm thinking specifically of Huntington, for example, they've had a number of dialogue initiatives, discussion initiatives like this, and they go ahead and plan at the beginning action summits. And so they know that they're going to have discussions in various places, and then they're going to have at some future point, like, weeks after, they're going to have an action summit where the people in the discussions can come together. So there are neighborhood associations in Huntington, and I think there were 12 of them. And so they had the discussions in each of the 12 neighborhood associations, and then they had what they called a community-wide action summit, where people from the 12 neighborhood conversations came together to set directions on what they wanted to do in order to improve the safety and quality of life in Huntington. And they came up with a whole range of actions that they wanted to take. And then they formed like little teams of people that wanted to work on them. Now, in some cases, of course, in your community, these issues don't just start from scratch. There's already a ton of stuff happening in your community on safety or on substance abuse or on all the other things that we've mentioned here today. And so it's part of it is tying it into work that's already happening and seeing if there are new directions people want to take. I don't know if any of you are from Fayette County on the call today, but this has probably been about 10 years ago. There were 14 discussions in different parts of Fayette County. And so people had a conversation closer to where they lived. And then they came to Fayetteville. And I forget what the name of, there's like a gymnasium in downtown Fayetteville. But anyway, the Action Summit was on the floor of that gymnasium. And they came up with ideas from their discussions of things they wanted to do together. One of them was they wanted to start a Narcotics Anonymous group. Even though Fayette County is a big county, at that time, there were AA groups, but there wasn't a single NA group. And they thought that people would benefit from that. Within 6 weeks, one of the churches had done what they needed to do to organize an NA group, and they started providing rides to people who wanted to come to the group who didn't have either a valid driver's license or a way of transportation to get there. And so that happened right away. But other things that are less tangible occurred, like there were people there from the Chamber of Commerce. There were people there from the Day Report Center, which you probably know. The Day Report Center is, we have more than one in West Virginia, but it's a daytime incarceration for nonviolent people convicted of nonviolent felonies. And so there were people at this Action Summit from the Day Report Center. Their counselor got permission to bring them there under her supervision because they were still basically incarcerated. But there were people there from the Chamber of Commerce and the County Commission, and there were people from all walks of life. And they broke up into these small groups. And when they broke up into the small groups, I couldn't see what they were saying, but I knew that, I could tell they were having some pretty vibrant conversations. When it was over, a young man from the Day Report Center, who'd been convicted of not just drug possession, but breaking and entering because of getting money to buy drugs, he came over to me and he said, "Did you see that who I was talking to?" It was like one of the community leaders. And he said, "He was really listening to me. I thought he would think I was a throwaway kid." And then later, when I was walking to the parking lot, the man that he was talking about, who didn't know that I'd had this conversation, came over to me and said, "Well, I guess I'm not such an old fogey. They were really listening to me." And so they kind of forged this sense that the stereotypes they had of each other, in this case, were not true. That they did have something to learn from each other, and they set up kind of an ongoing communication where the people in the judicial system were more connected to the people that were at the Day Report Center. I don't know if that's still going on, but it certainly started after that. There was a student body president from one of the high schools there, and she got this thing going where all of the county high schools had forums during school time about prescription drug abuse. Or drug abuse in general, specifically prescription drug abuse, which was a massive thing. There were trainings for students to become the moderators of the discussions, and the principals agreed that these could happen either in health classes or in social studies classes, or they just had time where the whole school was able to do this. So there were just really profound things that happened. They had an idea that they hope that one day they'll get a treatment center in Fayette County. I know that hasn't come to pass yet, but people certainly were kind of either reinvigorated or inspired to work on that. There's just any number of things that have happened in communities, literally hundreds of things that I've been in a privileged position to get to see happen because I'm listening to people from all over the state and see these things occur. So now, again, sometimes people want to become more informed about the issue. They aren't necessarily planning to connect with others and work on some kind of common in some kind of common direction, but other people want to do that. So what you would do as a library that provided this opportunity is that you could be kind of a catalyst for people who wanted to learn more about the issue, and for those people, those ones who wanted to work together in some way and connect with others. We were always saying that it's important to think about connecting with work that's already happening while also bringing new people into the mix, because we know that many of the people that are most affected by these very serious public issues are the people that sometimes are least heard from. And so having discussions where librarians do the kind of outreach or work with partners in the community that will allow people to have an opportunity to talk to each other, it's a rare phenomenon. And so that's a major service that I think expands the civic role of libraries in this country. Anything else? Well, let me just give you some contact information then. I think that's my next slide up here. Whoops, here we go. First of all the materials that I described to you, the discussion guides, the videos, the questionnaires, the slides you can use on Zoom, the tips and strategies for using online, all of that you can find at nifi.org. When you go to nifi.org, you'll see this big logo that says "With the People." You can't miss it. So just click on that and you'll get to a page that has resources and strategies and partners and all these other kinds of things. If you're going to do this work in your own community, I think the idea of developing partners that Karen mentioned is a really important one. Diet Coke. Okay. Yeah, if you have any questions, if you have a question that you think we need to answer kind of with the national materials, you can write info@nifi.org, and that'll get to us. But if you have an issue, a question that's more directly related to West Virginia, something that might be done here in West Virginia that you think we need to answer here, then info@wvciviclife.org. To tell you the truth, I'll probably see both of them, with whichever one you write to, because even though I now work with the National Issues Forums Institute, as Karen said, I am a volunteer for life with the West Virginia Center for Safe Life. So either way, I'll probably get a chance to see what you write. But the national questions, probably, if it's something about the materials or something, you can just send that to info@nifi.org. Is there any other contact information you need beyond what I have here, the website and the 2 emails? Okay. One thing I was going to
and they can always contact me if they have something. I'll be glad to pass it on to you, Betty.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ken. I think the chat shows the involvement and the investment of the libraries in something like this.
Oh, I really appreciate the chance to be with you all today, and to Karen and to the whole team at the planning this conference that made that happen. I'm really excited about exploring some of the ideas about any kind of training opportunities or online workshops for facilitating that we could do. If there's some kind of common topic that connected libraries all across the state, that would be really cool. So you give some time to kind of think about that and digest it. And Karen and I know each other well, and we know exactly how to get in touch with each other. So she and I can continue to talk, and hopefully there'll be some next step that's really useful to your work. And I just want to close by saying thank you so much for the incredible work that you do in this state. As a almost lifelong resident of West Virginia, I've just benefited from libraries. My children have benefited from libraries. It's just been such a rich resource for our own private, personal lives, and also for the very great public work that is done through libraries. So thank you for that. I know you're facing massive challenges right now, because I get to talk to librarians a lot. And I am just impressed with the kind of perseverance and the ability to meet all of these new challenges. I talked to a librarian in Topeka, Kansas the other day, who told me that my job, she said, I hardly get to do anything that I was doing 6 months ago. And pretty much everything I'm doing now, I wasn't doing 6 months ago. But we just had to adapt and keep trying new things to be able to still be of service to the community. So I'm very well aware of how much juggling you're doing right now. But as you digest what we're talking about today and you want to move forward with it, I'd love to be some kind of resource to you in any way that's useful.